All right, so we're diving into the Golden State Warriors today. And, some of the articles you sent over about their struggles, like, honestly, some of this stuff is pretty wild.
Yeah, it's a really interesting situation they're in trying to stay on top, trying to keep that dynasty thing going. But the rest of the league's caught up and their roster isn't quite what it used to be.
Yeah, and from the sounds of it, things aren't exactly peachy behind the scenes either.
Mm.
I mean, Steve Kerr using the word demoralizing to describe those blowouts, that's not exactly the, championship vibe we're used to from them.
Yeah, that's a really interesting word choice, isn't it? Demoralizing. It's like it suggests a deeper frustration, maybe even a feeling of helplessness. These aren't just losses, they're really hitting the team's morale hard.
Yeah, and it's not just like one bad game here either. I mean, that Celtics game, that was actually their second biggest loss of the whole season. Remember that 41-point loss to the Grizzlies? Ouch.
Yeah, yikes. That's rough. It really points to some like systemic problems, not just, a couple of off nights. Take their transition defense, for example, against the Celtics. It was practically non-existent.
Yeah.
And you combine that with Draymond, his lateral quickness isn't what it used to be, and you've got a recipe for getting torched pretty consistently.
Yeah, speaking of getting torched, all the articles are talking about the pressure on Steph
Yeah.
to carry this team. I mean, he even compared this season to their 2021-22 championship run, which feels like a bit of a stretch, right?
It's a bold statement for sure. I mean, the core of the team is there, but the league's landscape has shifted. Teams have figured out how to counter the Warriors system, and the roster isn't as deep, but I
Yeah.
mean, Curry's belief, even if it seems, a little far-fetched, might be what they need to stay afloat.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the roster because Kerr's long-term vision seems kind of like at odds with how urgent things are right now.
Yeah.
He's talking about the Warriors thriving even after this core is gone, which is admirable, but is that realistic at this point?
It is really forward thinking, but it also shows how tough of a position he's in. He's got to build for the future without throwing away the present. And that's a tough balance, especially with a player like Curry, who's not going to be content with, just riding it out.
Right. And then there's the elephant in the room, Curry's ultimatum. He wants to win now. And that puts a ton of pressure on the front office to make moves.
Yeah.
What kind of impact is that having on their decision-making?
Well, it definitely adds another layer of complexity. They can't afford to upset their superstar, but they also can't mortgage their future for short-term gains. So they've got to make some tough choices. Do they prioritize loyalty to their core, or do they shake things up to try and, meet Curry's demands and his desire to win?
Yeah, it's like a classic dilemma, right? Loyalty versus ambition. It's almost like, Shakespearean the aging king and the impatient heir.
Okay, I see what you're getting at, but Draymond's no King Lear.
But seriously, though, yeah, totally right. It's this constant, back and forth between what Curry wants and what the franchise needs to do to stay relevant, long term.
Exactly, and it's all happening as the league's changing around them. Teams aren't scared of the Warriors anymore. They've figured out the system. They've come up with ways to counter it, and the Warriors haven't really adapted fast enough.
Yeah, that's a good point. The league's definitely caught up. And maybe the Warriors are just a little too stuck in the past, clinging to what worked before. So how do they break out of this cycle? Can they even win now and still build for the future?
It's a tough balancing act for sure. They need to be super strategic with any moves they make. I think the key is to bring in players who can contribute right away without completely sacrificing their young core. Think savvy veterans who can bring leadership and stability, guys who have been there, done that.
So you're thinking not necessarily blockbuster trades, but more like targeted additions to fill those gaps.
Yeah.
What about all these rumors of bringing in some players from the Jazz? That seems to be the hot topic in these articles.
The Jazz are an interesting case because they're clearly in rebuilding mode right now, and they do have a few pieces that could fit in really well with the Warriors, but it all comes down to cost. Are the Warriors willing to part with some of their young prospects like Kuminga or Moody to get a deal done?
That seems to be the sticking point, right? The articles mention that the Warriors are really hesitant to trade their young guys, which makes sense. But is that hesitation preventing them from making moves that could help them win now?
It's a tough call. You can't blame them for wanting to hold on to their future, but they also have a player like Curry who's in his prime and wants to win championships. They can't just let those prime years slip away while waiting for the younger guys to develop.
It's like they're caught between a rock and a hard place. So what's the solution? Is there even a way to make everyone happy?
It's not impossible, but it's going to require some really smart decision-making and maybe even a little bit of luck. They might have to look into multi-team trades, get creative with contracts, and maybe even try to find some undervalued players who they can get without giving up too much. Think of it like a high-stakes poker game where they're trying to win the hand without showing all their cards.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
It really captures the kind of strategic maneuvering that needs to happen. But even with the best strategy, there's always some risk,
Right.
right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Every move they make could have huge consequences.
Mhm.
Do they focus on filling an immediate need, even if it means giving up a young player with a lot of potential? Or do they hold on to their assets and just hope that internal development is enough to get them back on track? It's a gamble either way.
Yeah, so it seems like the Warriors are in a pretty tricky spot. What are some of the specific trade scenarios that are being talked about in these articles?
Well, one article suggested going after a veteran point guard and a solid center from the Jazz. The idea is that, you give Steph some help with handling the ball, and you also shore up their interior defense, which has been a real problem for them.
Right, that makes sense. But you mentioned earlier that the Warriors don't really want to trade away their young prospects. Is there any way to make those kinds of trades without, sacrificing the future?
It's tough, but it's not impossible. They might have to get a little creative, maybe involve a third team to make the deal more appealing. Or they could look for players who are on expiring contracts so they can provide some short-term value without a long-term commitment.
So it sounds like the Warriors are in a really delicate situation. They've got their legacy to think about, a superstar who wants to win now, and a future they need to build.
Yeah.
So what's the takeaway here for our listener? What does all of this mean for the future of the Warriors?
I think the big question is, can they reconcile those competing priorities? Can they find a way to balance keeping Curry happy and winning now while also setting the franchise up for success down the road? It's a tough balancing act, and there's no easy answer.
Yeah, it sounds like Warriors fans are in for a wild ride these next few months. Lots of tough decisions to be made and maybe some big moves coming.
Definitely. This is a team in transition, and it's going to be fascinating to see what moves they make or don't make. It's a reminder that even dynasties have to adapt to a changing league and deal with the pressure of winning now.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We talked about the Warriors' struggles, the internal dynamics, those trade possibilities, and what it all means for their future. Any final thoughts for our listeners before we wrap things up?
I would just say keep an eye on the Warriors. This is a crucial moment in their history, and the choices they make will have an impact on the entire league. It's a reminder that even in a sport where superstars get all the attention, the decisions made behind the scenes, the strategies and the trades, they can be just as important as what happens on the court.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And to our listeners, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and we'll catch you on the next one.